Now I'm absolutely honored and I would love to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Karen Clark. I'm sure that for most of you, Karen doesn't need to be introduced, but I still would love to do that. Karen has achieved so much that it would likely take me hours to give you a proper introduction. Suffice it to say that she has incredibly been able to revolutionize our industry at least twice. Karen has worked closely with hundreds of scientists and other experts from around the world, and she has valuable perspective not only on how scientific models work, but how they are built and what this means for model users. So in this session, she'll share with us a few insights that she learned through her career. We may never think about scientific model the way we were thinking before. So Karen, it's all yours. It's pleasure and honor. Let's switch to Karen.
Well, thank you, Anna, for that very kind introduction. You're making me tear up. And I have to start out by saying I have been so fortunate to be in such an interesting industry. And I've had the opportunity, of course, to work with many cool people in the insurance industry. And also, as Anya said, some of the best and brightest scientists from around the world in so many fascinating disciplines. So how lucky is that? And obviously, through that process, working with the best and the brightest, I learned a lot. And not only about the science, but about the scientists who developed the model. And so today, what I'm going to do is share with you a few insights that I've gained over those many years of working in the industry. Now, as Anya alluded to, when I first started in this business, to most people, especially in the insurance industry, a model meant either a tall, skinny woman walking down a runway or a little kit that you bought your child to make a toy airplane or a toy car. And it was very difficult to convince underwriters that this little computer model and something called Monte Carlo simulation was going to do a better job at quantifying catastrophe risk than their tried and true rules of thumb. Now, of course, we've come a long way from then, and today scientific models are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. And in fact, with today's computers, we kind of take for granted that we can model anything. But I think it's maybe despite the prevalence of models, or maybe because of the prevalence of models, there are some misconceptions about models. And we sometimes get things wrong when we talk about models. The first thing that we get wrong, and I do this as well, is we tend to say the models are based on science. Now, that's not exactly correct. The models are not really based on science. They're based on scientific assumptions. And in most cases, those scientific assumptions are not scientific facts, although we treat them as such. Now, the catastrophe models are based on thousands of assumptions, and most of those assumptions are not based on an abundance of data. They're based on expert opinion and expert judgment. The whole reason for the development of catastrophe models is that catastrophes, fortunately, in specific locations are infrequent, which means we don't have a lot of data. So catastrophe models are really the opposite of big data. They're little data. And I'll use earthquake risk in the US to illustrate this point. Now, when you think of earthquake risk in the US, you no doubt think of California. And probably even what would come to mind is the great San Francisco earthquake of 1906. But actually, that was probably not the largest magnitude earthquake that has impacted the US. In 1811, there was a large earthquake that occurred in the central US near a little town called New Madrid, Missouri, which is in the southeast corner of the state. Now, of course, there were no seismographs at the time, but scientists believe that the area felt by this event was 10 times larger than the area felt by the 1906 earthquake. Now, why do they believe that, and how do they determine the magnitude? Well, they have to go to the data. Okay, so what data was available to inform scientists today about the magnitude of the event? Well, the only data available was actually from newspaper accounts and journal accounts. So you might have heard them yourself. Church bells rang in Boston and sidewalks cracked in New York. So what scientists had to do is piece together all of those accounts and develop these lines here, which are called isoseismals, to try to match the reported damage to something called the modified Mercalli intensity scale. So they had to use these reports to infer the magnitude. Now, some of you may know that the USGS puts out a report every 6 years on earthquake hazard in the US, and it's the basis for the seismic hazard maps that are used for building codes and all sorts of important areas with respect to managing earthquake risk. Well, what I'm going to show you now is what has been embodied in those reports as the science has evolved. Now, in 1996, there was only one scientist seriously working on central US, and that was Art Johnston. And he pieced together these reports and said he thought the magnitude was an 8, and oh, by the way, the return period is about 1,000 years. 6 years later, in 2002, Sue Hoff analyzed the same data, but she concluded that the ground motion felt far away was caused by bad soil. So really the magnitude was probably smaller. But let's bring in the uncertainty and give some weight to different magnitudes here. But she said it could have been as low as a magnitude 7.3. But oh, by the way, the return period is 500 years. Now, the practice in the earthquake community is to weight the different analysis of different scientists. And by 2008, that process became so complex that they had to start developing logic trees, what they call logic trees. Now, I know you can't read this, and don't worry about it, it's not important. I just wanted to give you a visualization of the increasing complexity. So here, for example, instead of just believing that the return period could be 500 years or 1,000 years, additional scientists have said, well, maybe it could have been 750 years or maybe 1,500. Fast forward to today, and I know you're not going to read this, but more scientists have come in and seemingly more precise, because instead of, if you could read it, you would see that some of these return periods now are 1,613 years, 714 years. Okay, they seem like they're very, very precise. But again, they all go, now to be fair, there have been paleoliquefaction studies and other studies in the area, so we have supplemented the data, but we're still left with a lot of uncertainty. So, but as the logic tree is complex. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. Of course, we need this. There's nothing wrong with assumptions. We need to use these assumptions. The problem comes in when we start believing them, and particularly when scientists start believing them. And they can become very enamored with their assumption and believe they are correct. And when they're talking to us mere mortals, lay people, it can sound very convincing, and they can sound very right about their beliefs. I remember one conversation I had with a very esteemed expert seismologist at AIR many years ago, and he was giving very convincing scientific evidence that he knew the return period was not any shorter than 1,000 years, and he was sure of that. So I asked him, I said, well, that's good, but what would you say if an event happened tomorrow? And he said, well, I'd say I was wrong. And they can do that. Scientists can do that. So there's a very important lesson that is kind of the offshoot of this that I heard from another very wise scientist. And this scientist was actually giving a talk. I can't remember what it was, at one of the AIR conferences. And he said that, I'm a big PhD from MIT, and I might be smarter than everyone in this room, but I'm not smarter than the data. And that has always stuck with me. And it's something that we all have to remember, that no matter how many scientists work on a model, and no matter how complex the models get, we're not smarter than the data. Full stop. Now, the other important and related insight to this is complexity does not equal accuracy. The natural expectation is that as more scientists work on a model and they become more complex, that the model output is automatically going to become better, i.e. more accurate. And of course, I myself believed that for a long time. And I thought we just keep adding more and more scientists and getting bigger and bigger, and our models are going to automatically become more accurate. But eventually I realized after a point that the models are not necessarily becoming more accurate. They're becoming different. And additional complexity can actually make the models less accurate. Now, why is that? Because more complexity means more opportunities for what? Mistakes. Now, think about it. All of these assumptions, now, think of it, these assumptions are just for one component, part of one component of one model in one region for one peril. So for one individual model, there are thousands of these assumptions. And what needs to happen? These assumptions need to be changed into equations and algorithms, and eventually tens of thousands of lines of computer code. So it is a long road from scientific theory to actual loss estimates for insurers. And it's very easy when you have 10,000 lines of cryptic computer code developed by many different scientists and software developers over many years. It's very easy for mistakes to crop in. Now, here is an area where I believe recently I've been misunderstood. My point is, complexity does not automatically lead to accuracy. Now, this does not mean I think complexity is bad. On the contrary, some of KCC's models are way more advanced and complex than even the two more established modeling companies. So I'm not saying that complexity is bad, but what I am saying is as the models get more advanced and more complex, the scientific process needs to advance as well to account for the added complexity. And I'll explain what I mean in a few minutes. Now, these models are developed by super smart people with PhDs from the best universities around the world. Now, the experts who work for me and who have worked for me are extremely intelligent, they're highly educated, and they're definitely a lot smarter than I am. But there is something I've learned that they haven't yet figured out. And that is, there is a very difficult thing for a very smart person can do. And I'm sure you all guessed it. It's really difficult for a super smart person to even imagine that they might have made a mistake. And I've learned that these very smart people can be inclined to accept, and not only that, but be able to explain very convincingly why counterintuitive model output is correct versus thinking they might have made a mistake. So when you see a strange number come out of a model, How do you know if it's correct or if it's a mistake? Well, you need to remember Clark's law. There's a Clark's law now, and that is if it doesn't look right, it probably isn't right. Now, how do I implement Clark's law at KCC? Now, of course, there is no point in trying to argue with a PhD who is always right. There's no point to that. You're not going to get anywhere. So I've developed a different strategy, and that is show me, don't tell me. Show me what you did. Don't tell me what you did. And in order to help KC scientists show me, I like pretty pictures. And so the KCC software developers have implemented very advanced high resolution visualization tools within our software so that we can all, and this includes our clients, can actually see how the science has been implemented to make sure it's been implemented correctly. So here's an example. Let's look at flood risk and storm surge. Now, this is probably the most complex, highest resolution model there is. Our flood model runs at 30-meter resolution. And of course, there are thousands and thousands of footprints in our models. Now, how do we know that all the science that goes into this is implemented correctly? Well, we provide our scientists and our clients with what we call our intensity footprints. And you see one here for an event, this is actually a return period footprint. Now, you can't look at that and say, oh, yeah, that's absolutely correct. But I can tell you that first versions of a model, you can tell that something looks wrong. And as I always say, I don't know the right answer, but I certainly know a wrong answer. So you can verify and compare the footprint to other data like high resolution footprints, high resolution elevation data. So the idea is you want to trust but verify. And you need to verify not because anything is bad there. It's just that these models are so complex. We need to have the ability to trust but verify. The same thing with the model vulnerability equations. In any model, for one peril, one region, there'll be thousands of vulnerability equations. So how do you know they're all implemented correctly? So we provide our engineers and also our clients with visualization tools so that they can check their work. So in my view, if you want accurate models, if that's important to you, transparency is not a nice to have, it's a must have. You must have transparency, not 10,000 pages of model documentation that nobody reads anyway, but just show me a picture and show me what goes into your model. Now, my final and most important point is real events matter. Now, here's the primary output of a catastrophe model, the EP curve, exceedance probability curve. Now, most of you are probably familiar with this, and I'm not going to dwell on it, but just quickly, for those of you who are not, it's very straightforward, but basically, again, it's the purpose of a catastrophe model to give insurers estimates of the probabilities of losses of different sizes based on their portfolio. And that's what you actually get from that. Couple of points that are very important is the 1% probability, or the so-called 1 in 100 PML, or the 0.4%, the 1 in 250 PML. And by the way, you can also get your AALs from this, so all your pricing. So this is like the most important thing about a model is this output. Now, this curve, this is developed from an event set of thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of hypothetical events. Okay, that's what the models do. They generate these very large samples, because we don't have the actual data, of hypothetical events that are supposed to represent the frequencies and severities of events of different sizes. So this is based on hypothetical events. And model users, they spend a lot of time obviously evaluating the underlying science, and there aren't a lot of real events to test this. But again, real events that we do matter. Now, I have to tell you now, the most memorable conversation that I ever had with a scientist in my entire career. This was, again, way back at AIR. What we do, what the modelers do, is at the end of the process, again, most of the time building a model is on all the science I talked about, all the engineering, and traditionally just a little bit of time is spent at the end trying to validate the output. So we were validating a model, and the scientist who developed the model was showing us how well the model compared to actual events, actual losses. And I said, it doesn't look that good. I don't think the model results really look that close to kind of actual loss figures. And he just looked at me and said, oh, don't worry about that. That's reality. The model is much better than reality. Now, that may sound a little funny, but the problem is, I think a little that has kind of pervaded the industry, where we discount real events because it's just really the fake events, the hypothetical events that matter. And what's happened is, of course, when we have real events, the industry gets jaded because the long established models have been pretty abysmal at giving good information at real events as they happen. Maria was a classic example. One model says 13 to 26 billion. Another model says 30 to 70 billion. And of course, the real number threaded the needle and was 27 billion. Okay, so take the most recent February Arctic air outbreak. It's going to cost the industry over $15 billion. Some of the modelers didn't even have that in their EP curve, but that's okay. That's okay. It's they're hypothetical events. It's all that matters. Now, of course, it does matter to insurers. And I think the impetus for our next panel, at least part of it, is that insurers have started losing confidence, and they don't have a high degree of confidence in these EP curves. So we have to change that. I mean, what is the point of all this great science and all this great work if you're not confident with the output? The model's purpose is to give output. You don't have a model for its model's sake, but to give credible output to users. So why? What can we do? Well, one of the things we have to do, and now I'm going to start segueing into how KCC is different. Okay, so if you look at hurricanes, for example, everyone that's tracking in the US, and around the world, actually, we give our clients one number that we believe will be, and they can do this for themselves. And they can use that for their claims adjusting, how many claims they're going to have, and where they're going to be. This is not only valuable information in itself, but it's also a good validation of the model. And I'll give you another example of why it's important. We go back to our exceedance probability curve here, and we know there's uncertainty around it. And there are two sources of uncertainty. One is around the probability of an event. That's back to our New Madrid example. What is the probability of a magnitude 8 or a large magnitude? But the second source of uncertainty is, given an event, what is the loss going to be? So this is where, if you test a model with real events, you can actually reduce this uncertainty and you can have more reliable EP curves. Now, severe convective storm is the most frequent peril there is. Every day there are thunderstorms causing wind damage, in somewhere in the US. So this is a daily occurrence. So it's a little counterintuitive to think, well, if it's so frequent, why are the models so bad? But this is the model that insurers have the least, one of the models they have the least confidence in. And so when KCC got into the bottling business, one of the first models our clients wanted to talk about was was this model. So we developed, so our scientists understood that before they can even build a stochastic model, they need to be able to reproduce actual events. Real events matter. And so that has worked every day. KCC systems ingest over 30 gigabytes of high resolution data from all the satellites, all the weather models, and all the radar. And our clients get every day a high resolution footprint that they can use for hail and both for tornado wind that they can use for their claims, adjusting for that day. Now, again, that not only is valuable, but it gives feedback to us on how accurate our model is, so we can continue to make it more accurate. So what KCC is doing is actually bringing confidence back into the models by having more accurate output. This is a slide, not that we created, but Progressive, one of our clients, showing that it can be done. It can be done with a slight change to the scientific process. Obviously, Model C is KCC here, where we match really well Progressive's actual SCS losses experience year on year. The other two major models are woefully inadequate. So it can be done not just by making the models more complex, but by having a more complex scientific process that actually can deal with complexity and accuracy. Okay, so in conclusion, I'm getting the hook here. In conclusion, you've all heard George Box's famous statement, all models are wrong, some are useful. Well, the next time you hear it, you tell them, well, Karen Clark says models that are less wrong are more useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen, so much. As expected, undoubtedly, it's very inspiring for our next session. Look, I got a number of questions to you. I'm going to read just one, and maybe the rest of them will move to the panel, if that's okay. The more assumptions, the more model risk. Have you ever tested the model sensitivity to the assumptions? If so, what assumptions are the most critical?
Right. Yeah, that is a great question. And,
Thank you,
you know, of course, we do that all the time. And there are, I mean, catastrophe models, you have the worst of all worlds. You have high uncertainty and high sensitivity. And it's sometimes surprising the variables that the models are most sensitive to. And I'll give you an example. We always think about the frequency or severity, kind of the rate assumptions. But those you actually, insurers, you can test them usually yourself. And Greg Richardson will tell you how they, handle that. But it's actually the more detailed assumptions. Like my favorite assumption that drives me crazy is on hurricanes. There's something called surface friction. And the modelers have to make an assumption if the winds go over a rough terrain like an urban area or an open thing like a field, how the winds are going to change. And also the fetch, like how much it has to go over. It seems like just like an inconsequential assumption, but changing that assumption a little bit can lead to, like 50% changes in loss estimates in a geographical region. So yes, we test those all the time. And that is why you can't just change an assumption for the sake of change. When at KCC, the loss estimates inform our assumptions. So when we see the claims data back, that it allows us to go back and say which assumptions may have to be tweaked, because this is a big problem the industry has had with radical model updates just because a scientist decided to update an assumption, and it may not even be a better assumption. It's just a different assumption, and that I don't know who asked that question, but that is just a really great question. And it is something that, catastrophe modeling companies have to be on top of and make sure they're understand that, and they're only changing the assumptions that should be changed to make the model more accurate. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
No, thank you, Karen, and thank you, Vlad, for asking